Continuing from the previous part, the poisoning incident caused quite a stir in the palace. All the officials and nobles gathered, deeply worried for them. Fortunately, Vian was unharmed and had the presence of mind to apprehend the poisoner. However, the boy kept blaming himself for being there and letting this happen. As a knight who trained daily to protect others, he had to witness them collapse before him. Luckily, the queen arrived just in time at the crown prince's quarters and managed to provide first aid. Without her, Vian couldn't imagine what the outcome might have been. The royal physician stepped out and, bowing low, dared not meet their eyes. Aisha had only ingested a small amount of poison, but her young body couldn't handle it. As for Isis, he drank the entire cup of tea and was in critical condition. The only hope now lay in the power of the priests, but since it was the spring festival, they had all gone on a pilgrimage and wouldn't return for 4 days, far too long to wait. Just thinking of his 2 precious children, the emperor clenched his fists and commanded that every effort be made to save them. Among the crowd, whispers started to surface. Some suggested this was a bad omen, or that the ruler was unworthy. These words reached the emperor's ears, and he gave the speaker a very affectionate look. Faced with the icy stare of the ruler, the man dared not lift his head under the emperor's threatening words. Since today was the spring festival, the emperor spared his life, but if his mouth continued to run wild, he'd cut out his tongue and feed it to the crows. That warning left the man trembling in fear. However, as soon as the emperor turned away, he flashed a sinister grin. The queen, staying by Aisha's side, held her daughter's small hand. Their strength was limited, they could only stop the spread of the poison. To fully eradicate it, a greater divine power was needed. Hearing this, the queen could only wait, tears streaming down her face, as Aisha's expression showed clear discomfort. In her dream, Aisha found herself in a dark space. Before she understood what was happening, chains appeared from behind, shackling her legs. When she looked up, she was no longer Aisha but had transformed into her previous life, Elisa, imprisoned in a dungeon. Her throat was parched, burning with thirst. A basin of water sat nearby, left who knows when. Though she didn't want to, she chose between that and dying of thirst. She reached out, but her hand was too weak, causing the basin to tip over. In utter despair, she curled into a ball, wishing death would come swiftly. Bitter questions filled her mind. Why did her family only believe in Marianne? She huddled up, waiting for the end, but suddenly a voice called out, waking the darkness inside her. It urged her to ask why her family wanted to kill her, though no matter how much she screamed, they never heard a word. Yet the voice denied her despair, reminding her that others were out there, believing in her and waiting for her. She hadn't realized it, but after seeing the fireworks in her happy memories, the faces of Isis, the queen, and the emperor appeared, each reaching out their hands as if waiting for her. Seeing this, she quickly wiped away her pointless tears and began to regain her composure. Now, she was Aisha, not the forsaken Elisa of before. The chains finally dissolved. Returning to her present form, she stepped out of the darkroom into the open sky. Yet no matter how far she ran, the way out still eluded her. The light was right ahead, yet she couldn't reach it, frustrating the small princess, who threw herself down in a tantrum. She started to think deeply about the light, feeling its warmth like her family. But it wasn't just her family, many others loved her despite not sharing her blood. Once she understood this, light began to radiate from her hand as it touched her chest. A satisfied expression crossed Aisha's face. At last, she had found clarity. She stood up, dusted herself off, and declared that what Elisa couldn't do, Aisha could. She extended her small hands with utmost confidence and summoned Ru. When the queen was crying her eyes out, Aisha finally managed to wake up. As soon as she saw her precious child safe and sound, she rushed to embrace Aisha. Back in the warm embrace, Aisha felt a bit suffocated but still immensely comfortable, remembering those hands. After the priest diagnosed that her life was no longer in danger and she just needed rest and continued treatment to recover, the queen could finally breathe a sigh of relief. However, she stiffened when Aisha asked about Isis's condition. Upon hearing that he was hanging by a thread, she was deeply shocked. She had only been exposed to a small amount of poison and already felt like she had died and come back to life, and it was only thanks to the support of the light spirit that she had regained consciousness. Just thinking about the pain Isis must be going through brought her to tears, and she urgently wanted to go to him. Grabbing the medicine prepared by the temple, she gulped it down in one go, to the astonishment of everyone else. Meanwhile, the emperor and Vian were anxiously worrying about Isis's condition. As the queen, carrying the newly awakened Aisha, entered with a pale face, the emperor was both relieved to see his daughter safe but still concerned about her frail state. Aisha ignored her father's worry and immediately rushed to check on Isis. Each step felt heavy and laborious. But upon seeing him writhing in pain, struggling even as the priest did his best, she became frantic and forced her mind to race for solutions. Just the thought of her brother never waking up again terrified her, causing her to clutch her dress tightly. She calmed herself down, vowing that she would save Isis. With determined eyes, she called for Rue, who burst into tears of joy upon seeing Aisha awake and unharmed. But before they could reunite for long, Aisha immediately asked the critical question: was she currently skilled enough to summon another high-level spirit? Hearing this, Rue quickly tried to stop her, warning that Aisha's current health wasn't strong enough to summon such a spirit, it was too dangerous. But when Aisha mentioned using a magic stone for support, Rue hesitated. Success was uncertain, but that uncertainty gave her hope. Rue, being a low-level spirit, only had healing powers similar to an ordinary priest's, which was insufficient to save her brother. Aisha decided it was time to reveal the true strength of her spirit summoner abilities, which she had hidden until now. She took the magic stone that Arsène had once brought her, which she always wore around her neck. After examining it for a long time, Rue couldn't sense the same strong mana from it as before. The magic power inside had been heavily depleted, not enough to summon even a mid-level spirit. Perhaps the stone had been used to help Aisha awaken quickly. Just when it seemed like they were out of options, Aisha had a sudden idea. She rushed over and grabbed Vian's hand to borrow his magic stone. Everyone present was filled with doubt and worry, unsure of what Aisha was doing as she started drawing on the floor. Even Vian was surprised that Aisha recognized him as a magic swordsman. Initially concerned about her fragile health after just waking up, he was startled by her serious expression. After a long time of drawing, Aisha finally completed a contract symbol, with Vian's red magic stone in the center. She quickly placed her hand on it and focused on reciting the contract incantation. The stone soon began glowing with a brilliant red light, but Aisha's strength was already waning. As she struggled to hold on a little longer, the magic stone finally reacted. From it emerged the figure of a person with the distinctive blonde hair of a light spirit. Seeing that she had successfully summoned a mid-level spirit, Aisha smiled softly and extended her hand to form a contract. The spirit Remir immediately kissed Aisha's small hand, sealing the pact between them. The spirit's face became clearer, revealing an incredibly beautiful young girl. The queen was still a bit hesitant, suddenly seeing a fairy appear before her. Aisha quickly corrected her, explaining that it was a spirit, not a fairy. With confidence and determination, she assured everyone that she could heal Isis. Both of them quickly assessed his condition. Once the spirit contract was formed, no matter where they were, the power of light could still be used. However, Aisha's body was currently too weak, so Rimmer didn't say much, staring at her the whole time. Then, without hesitation, she fused his power into Aisha. Remir's knowledge flowed directly into her brain. Not only did she gain skills, but her eyes also turned golden, allowing her to use the light power to heal Isis. This was the power of the light spirit. It was more exhausting than she expected, but seeing him respond brought her visible joy, motivating her to continue. However, the longer she persisted, the more her strength was drained. Seeing Isis's face twisted in pain, she recalled how, despite always being busy with work, studies, and preparing to become the heir, he had always made time for his little sister. His smile had always been warm, full of love for her. Now, seeing her brother's face in agony, fighting death, she pushed herself even harder, despite her body beginning to feel utterly drained, and her breath becoming more labored. Eventually, when she could no longer hold on, she collapsed to the ground. Fortunately, Vian reacted quickly enough to catch her. Seeing their child push herself to the point of fainting, both the emperor and empress were deeply worried. But Aisha wasn't willing to give up, and tears streamed down her face. She wanted to buy more time until the priest returned, but she couldn't do anything more. Just when it seemed all was lost, a familiar voice startled her. Everyone turned in surprise to see that not only had Isis awakened, but he was also smiling and talking. Seeing this, Aisha couldn't hold back any longer, and she immediately rushed forward to embrace Isis. The empress also burst into tears, forcing the newly awakened prince to comfort both women. After being told everything that had happened, Isis finally understood why Aisha had been so secretive about her ancient books. The priest, who had witnessed everything up until now, shyly suggested that Aisha might be a saintess. Aisha quickly denied it, confidently stating that she was a spirit summoner. To prove it, she called Rue, leaving everyone in awe and disbelief. No one had expected spirits to truly exist, but regardless, the emperor, who adored his daughter, pledged to support her in becoming the greatest summoner. Hearing this, Aisha let out a sigh of relief, grateful that they had been accepted so easily without any negative reactions. After seeing the priest's puzzled look about the light power, Aisha briefly explained how the god Luminous could create light spirits and bestow power upon the clergy. With this newfound understanding, the priest finally grasped that both powers came from the same source. Still fixated on making Aisha a saint, the priest remained persistent. Feeling pity for him, Aisha thought he could do whatever he wanted, but she wasn't going to conform to the clergy's rules, as she wanted to stay with her family. Everything was settled. Vian was eager to leave after being instructed to keep what had happened a secret. But things wouldn't end that easily. Isis demanded that the emperor find and punish those behind the plot. His eyes were cold, the coldest Aisha had ever seen. But it was no surprise, being the son of the emperor, who shared the same mindset. They both vowed to find the mastermind and flay him alive, then boil him in hot water. His entire family, even distant relatives, would be wiped out before the two would be satisfied. Even though they were discussing such brutal punishments, their faces were glowing with bright smiles. But Isis's determination didn't end there. He wanted the mastermind to experience the pain of seeing someone they loved poisoned before their eyes. This left everyone speechless. Truly, messing with anyone else would have been better than messing with a siscon. After a long period of recovery, Aisha still wasn't allowed to feed herself, having to be spoon-fed by her nanny. Though it felt somewhat humiliating, seeing the nanny's sparkling eyes, she couldn't bring herself to refuse. Finally, the mastermind behind the plot was caught, a northern noble who had once mocked Isis for being unworthy of succession. Even as he was shackled, he still showed no fear, hurling insults at Isis. Infuriated by the disrespect toward his beloved son, the emperor ordered the man's entire family, even their dogs, to be executed. However, that was only a small price to pay. What was suspicious was how such a low-ranking noble had dared to plot against the crown prince. There was surely someone supporting him from the shadows. The most chilling realization for Aisha was that the poison used on both her and her brother was the same toxin that Marianne had once been afflicted with. Just thinking about it sent her mind into a panic. But the one most frantic was not her, it was her nanny. Seeing Aisha clutching her chest, the nanny panicked and started crying loudly. For 3 weeks, Aisha was confined to her room. At last, she was allowed 30 minutes a day in the garden. While admiring the flowers, trees, and scenery, she spotted Isis and immediately brightened. The two siblings, as if spiritually connected, asked each other about their health in unison. After all this time, they finally had a moment to talk to each other like this. They were laughing happily, but suddenly Isis froze. The real reason he sought her out was that he had something to say, and his face clearly showed his concern. After a while of contemplation, he finally revealed that someone was backing the count. He then smiled gently when he saw Aisha's unsurprised reaction, as she was no stranger to maturity beyond her years. Despite being only 7, she was always calm and intelligent. However, the family wanted to protect their youngest, so they chose to hide the truth from her. Isis and the emperor had different thoughts, but Isis still wanted Aisha to know the truth so that if she ever encountered this person, she would be prepared. Isis respected Aisha's choice about whether she wanted to know who was behind it. No matter what, he had already decided to become stronger so he could protect this family. But Aisha immediately grabbed Isis's hands, which had been touching her face, and with determined eyes, she affirmed that she could face the truth and wanted to hear it. Aisha also wanted to protect her current family in this life, which was why she had always been striving to grow stronger. Of course, it wasn't easy to get the count to reveal the mastermind. Even if they tortured him, it was difficult to extract the information. So the emperor personally investigated and discovered that the puppet master was none other than someone from the Inderberg Empire. It wasn't clear who, but it was implied that it was one of the high-ranking royals. Currently, the empire was in chaos. When the crown prince ascended to the throne, many nobles formed factions. The root cause was the death of Elisa, the crown prince's half-sister, who had been charged with treason. Just hearing that name made Aisha tremble so much that she almost couldn't sit upright. Seeing the dazed look in his sister's eyes, Isis quickly looked for help. But what Aisha was most concerned about was why these two events were connected. It was all just speculation from Isis. However, it seemed that the crown prince wanted to stir up external conflict to distract the nobles who were focused on him, so he targeted the crown prince of Elmer, who was Isis. That's why Aisha was drawn into it. This made Isis feel extremely guilty toward his little sister because she had almost lost her life due to him. Just hearing this made her feel nauseous. That so-called family had tried to kill her time and time again. Whether it was in her past life or this one, they had always wanted her dead. Seeing Aisha's unusual reactions, Isis ordered the servant to take her back to rest, but Aisha stopped her and sent her away, saying that she had something important to tell him. When Isis urged her to rest, Aisha interrupted him with a grave tone, saying what she was about to reveal was serious. Seeing her tears flow made his heart ache, but when he heard that she had memories of her past life, it caused the hands that had been touching her cheeks to freeze. With a tear-streaked face, she began softly telling the story of how she was Elisa, the princess of the Inderberg Empire, and that she had been accused of treason against the royal family. She recounted how the nobles condemned her, how her family turned their backs on her, and how she was executed, causing Isis to fall silent. But her emotions reached a breaking point, and Aisha screamed that she had never intended to kill Marianne, all while tears streamed down her face. Her face was now smeared with tears and snot as she desperately tried to assert her innocence and begged Isis to trust her. Though she dared to speak, she wasn't confident that he would believe her. The deep-seated fear of being abandoned by family once again consumed her. That feeling of helplessness she had experienced in her past life, where no matter how hard she explained, no one believed her, was creeping back. But this wasn't the Crown Prince of Inderberg, this was Isis, who was entirely different. He believed every word his sister said, and this realization lit up her world with hope, causing her to sob uncontrollably. Isis gently patted her head. No matter what, he would always trust her because he knew his sister was kind-hearted. She was held in Isis's warm embrace, with his promise that even if the world turned against her, he would always believe in her. All of Aisha's pent-up frustrations and sorrows came pouring out as she cried, repeatedly thanking him. At last, she had someone who would stand by her. The wounds from her past life were finally healing. In the darkness where she had been wandering without direction, she now heard hurried footsteps behind her. A hand reached out to her, and for the first time, she stopped crying and rubbed her eyes. Seeing her like that, Isis grasped her small hands as if to make a promise that he would never turn his back on Aisha. Her enemies were his enemies as well, and no matter who they were, they would be dealt with. Isis pulled out his handkerchief and gently wiped away the remaining tears on her face. He then waited to see what his little sister wanted to do next. After a while of deep thought, Aisha finally spoke. She wanted revenge. She wanted to shed light on the events of her past life, clear her name, and vindicate Elisa with eyes full of determination. This resoluteness reassured Isis, and he was certain that he would support and assist her in clearing that injustice. He vowed that if Inderberg didn't beg for forgiveness, he would tear them apart. Being spoiled and trusted so completely, Aisha was submerged in this warm love, making her feel as though she were dreaming. Even though it was affirmed this wasn't a dream, but reality, the happiness here was overwhelming. It made her start to fear that one day she would wake up and everything would vanish. Hearing Aisha's worries, Isis agreed wholeheartedly, saying that even if it were a dream, he would protect it and make sure it lasted forever. Just like that, in that dark place, the hand reaching out was none other than Isis's, chasing after her. When she saw that it was her brother, Aisha finally managed a smile, and together they walked toward the light. Meanwhile, Crown Prince Rakiz had already arrived at the temple of Selena. He sighed in frustration because his plan to assassinate Isis had completely failed. If it were revealed that he was behind the plot, it would surely cause the collapse of the peace. The initial plan was to take advantage of the chaos following the Crown Prince's death to seize control of the Elmer Empire. But in the end, nothing went as expected, making Rakiz bitter and forcing him to adjust his strategy to prepare for the upcoming war. Inside the temple, he turned to see a girl draped in a white veil, Marianne, who had recently been promoted to the position of saintess. Despite their age, the two seemed to still have a close relationship. Marianne had a palace in the royal court, but she came to the temple because she claimed to feel closer to the god Selena there. Seeing her smile, Rakiz couldn't help but be reminded of how Elisa used to smile at him in the same way, but the memory made his head throb. Laughter echoed in his mind, startling him. It was a memory from childhood when Elisa was still on good terms with the other siblings. He recalled Elisa laughing brightly and smiling in his direction. Those memories made Rakiz's head pound like a hammer. He didn't know why, but just thinking of Elisa caused him intense pain. Even now, as he looked at Marianne, it seemed as though she was Elisa, worrying over him. Speaking of the failed poisoning attempt on the Elmer Crown Prince, Marianne expressed her regret, which only made Rakiz despise her. A saintess feeling sorry that someone didn't die? Looking back, the whole plan now seemed full of holes, like a reckless gamble. Yet somehow, he had agreed to it. Rakiz's head remained plagued by pain whenever he thought of his half-sister Elisa. But when she was sentenced to death, their mother, the Empress, remained untouched, while Rakiz, her brother, took the brunt of the blame. Fortunately, his siblings supported him in becoming king, as he was the crown prince. But the nobles always used Elisa's supposed crimes to undermine him. That anger only deepened his resentment toward her. Despite that, the memories of their time playing together as children lingered in his mind, and whenever he tried to think back more deeply, the pain returned, preventing him from thinking clearly. Pushing those thoughts aside, Rakiz reached out his hand toward Marianne to send her back. As soon as his hand touched her, Rakiz flinched, not because of her sinister smile in the shadows, but because of the coldness of her body. Her icy hand made him shudder, prompting him to compare it to the warmth of Elisa's hands, but he quickly dismissed the thought by reminding himself that Elisa was dead. He didn't notice that behind him, Marianne's true face had been revealed, her eyes glowing with a fiery red light. Yet, as soon as Rakiz turned back, she had returned to her saintly facade, with a gentle, serene smile. Let's talk a bit about Isis's past. When his mother passed away, he placed all the blame on himself, because for a long time, he had been by his mother's sickbed. The empress at the time had always been weak, but after giving birth to Isis, her health deteriorated rapidly. Isis constantly witnessed his mother writhing in pain on her sickbed, which filled him with fear. Even though his mother had been gone for over a year, Isis, being just a child, still believed it was his fault, despite his grandfather assuring him that the throne would one day belong to him. From then on, he was a child bound by strict rules, always forced to live coldly, never opening his heart to anyone. Although Isis could sense that his grandfather was obsessively concerned with the throne, he understood it, because ever since his mother passed, his position had become unstable. If another prince were born, he would surely be cast aside. So, little Isis closed off his heart. But when the new empress appeared, his grandfather warned him to stay away from her. Even so, Isis felt differently about her. She seemed kind. When he was younger, he always tried to avoid interacting with her, but the empress never gave up and constantly sent letters inviting him. Even as a child, he could sense the sincerity in those letters, always full of writing. Eventually, Isis was persuaded and came to her quarters, though he didn't dare approach her, only standing in a corner. Growing tired of constantly being confined by the title of prince or crown prince, he didn't notice the empress had approached him with a radiant smile. When she asked him why he had come, Isis immediately turned and walked away, leaving her bewildered. He ran off, reminding himself not to open his heart to anyone. Not long after, Isis overheard his father's voice and, out of curiosity, learned that the empress was pregnant. Everyone was overjoyed, even the emperor, who was eagerly awaiting the birth of his beloved child. Isis hid outside the door, fully aware that his position was about to be shaken. As he left, making no sound, only the empress inside noticed the door had been left ajar. The next day, while wandering alone, Isis was spotted by the empress. As soon as he saw her, he turned away. Despite her calling his name repeatedly, he stubbornly ran faster and faster, until he tripped over a rock and tumbled down a slope. The empress, watching from above, was deeply concerned as she saw him roll down. When he finally sat up, still dazed, he saw her running toward him, a reckless move for someone pregnant. Before he could warn her of the danger, the empress had already rushed to his side, grabbing his face to turn him 180 degrees and examine his injuries. Seeing his scraped knee, she was heartbroken to the point of tears. Instead of worrying about his injury, the stubborn child was only concerned about his dirty clothes. Frustrated, he told her that her concern for him was nothing but a burden. After saying that, Isis realized that it was easier to hurt someone than to avoid them. He then dragged his injured leg away, ignoring her calls. Even the thought of never receiving her letters or seeing her again made him feel uncomfortable, so he closed his eyes tightly. Yet when the empress called his name in a deep voice, it startled him, making him stop in his tracks, still unsure of what was happening. Before he knew it, the empress had effortlessly lifted him off the ground. After setting him down beside the rock, she tore her sleeve to bandage his wounded knee. Even as slow-witted as Isis was, he hadn't fully grasped what was happening. But he was brought to his senses when he saw the deep hurt in her eyes because he didn't value his own body. With a pained expression, she asked in a tearful voice whether it was because she wasn't his real mother that he disliked her. Though she received no answer, only his silent indifference, the empress gave a bitter smile and carried him back. Soon after, the emperor officially named Isis the crown prince, likely to secure his position before the second child was born. He knew his grandfather would be pleased, but he had no desire to live like a puppet, only doing as he was told. Gazing out the window, he watched a bird flying freely, and he wished he could be like that. But as a child, he thought there was nowhere else for him to belong. Holding the handkerchief, he recalled those words she had once told him, not to bear everything alone. He found himself longing to see the empress again since it had been so long since they last met. As if answering his thoughts, the empress appeared, her belly now noticeably larger, but her beauty still as radiant as ever. She was as kind and cheerful as if there had never been any conflict between them and invited Isis for tea. Entering her room, where many items had been prepared for the baby, Isis couldn't help but look around with interest. Just after sitting down, the empress got straight to the point, asking him for a favor, which reminded him of the words his grandfather had once said. Being cautious of the empress made Isis extremely tense, fearing that she might reveal her true face, just as his grandfather had warned. Contrary to Isis's fears, the empress made a suggestion. After the baby was born, she hoped Isis would become a good older brother, and it had already been predicted that the child was a girl. She hoped they could get along so that he wouldn't have to be alone anymore. Hearing this made Isis's small cheeks turn red. This was the first time he had been asked to take on the role of a brother, rather than being told to become the crown prince. At this moment, the empress was even more nervous than Isis. In the silence that followed, he shyly muttered that he would think about it. From that moment on, Isis gradually gave up his resentment and began visiting the empress's palace more often. His awkwardness and increasingly visible happiness, as he felt the warmth from her, became more apparent. Even when he first heard the sacred sounds from within the empress's belly, he felt an overwhelming sense of happiness. Not long after, the coronation ceremony for his title as crown prince was held. Within a month, his grandfather visited him, clearly delighted. At this moment, Isis mustered all his courage to speak. He confessed that he had no interest in being the crown prince, which shocked his grandfather. When he realized that he had been forcing his grandson to follow his desires all this time, he was even more taken aback. The burdens adults place on children have created immense pressure for young Isis ever since his mother's death. Even though he was ready to be reprimanded or turned away, he instead received an apology. His grandfather admitted that he had always understood this, but due to his selfishness after losing his daughter, he wanted to keep Isis close. Everything his grandfather had done until now was meant to protect his rights, but it had slowly transformed into his greed. Each time he looked into Isis's eyes, he was reminded of his lost daughter. Hearing this, Isis recalled the image of his late mother. Once again, he gathered his courage to express his feelings. The empress was not as terrible as his grandfather had believed. Hearing this, his grandfather seemed to have a moment of clarity and revealed to Isis that the empress was nearby. Isis, out of breath from running, rushed to find her but was intercepted by the emperor. Noticing the joyful expression on Isis's face, the emperor made his son blush with embarrassment. Seeing his child growing up, the emperor decided to share that his marriage to the empress had been a political one for the sake of the country, but he had also wanted to give Isis a mother who could love him. Hearing this, Isis immediately went to return the handkerchief he had been holding onto for so long but had never dared to speak about. Seeing the shy and adorable boy, the empress simply smiled. She then mentioned a dream she had, in which she saw a white bird flying in a sky filled with a radiant rainbow. This, she said, would be the name of Aisha, the white bird Isis had always wished to be like. This stirred Isis's young heart, and tears began to flow, causing the empress to worry. But after hearing his heartfelt confession, whether as an older brother or a prince, Isis now dared to open his heart and asked the empress if she could be his mother. Both he and the empress were overwhelmed with joy. She, feeling like the happiest person in the world, embraced her son, vowing to love both of her children. From that day on, Isis couldn't stop rubbing the empress's belly, urging Aisha to hurry and be born. Both siblings became each other's light and salvation. This is also why Isis always treats Aisha with such sincerity. And that's it for today. See you in the next part. Peace.